It's 5 past, so we'll make a start and I'll share my screen with you. Okay. Just need to see my chat. Where's my chat? Oh, yes. Okay. So, thanks everyone for coming. I'll make a start now. So this is just a summary of what we'll be covering today. So what is the EU settlement scheme, who can apply, some key dates, some information about what the different outcomes mean, the application process, and some of the specific requirements for children, non-EU family members, those non-EU family members whose circumstances have changed in relation to their EU sponsor, the issues that we found from helping individuals through this application process, what some of the barriers and the obstacles are, so that people can be aware of what to expect potentially, and the position of EU citizens entering the UK after the end of the transition period, which is currently set at 31st of December 2020. So what is the EU settlement scheme? The status has come into existence because of Brexit. Previous now, freedom of movement has allowed workers, those who are self-employed, students, retirees, to come to a member state and enjoy the same rights of freedom of movement that they have up to date. And the EU settlement scheme has been brought into existence because the UK is obviously leaving the European Union, and it's been set up to give EU citizens a status by which they can continue living, working and studying in the UK after the end, after we finally leave the European Union outside the transition period. So we'll be talking about the applications and successful applications and what the process is. The process is generally twofold. One is to evidence ID, so nationality via passports or national identity cards, and also then to evidence residency in the UK. So it's a really important status for individuals who want to remain in the UK to get. It is really, really important that people know about it, and make an application within the relevant deadline. So who can apply? EU, EEA, including Norwegian, Liechtenstein and Icelandic nationals, as well as Swiss nationals, will need to apply to this scheme, as will their family members, their non-EU family members. When we talk about family members, it is those individuals who are not EU themselves. Anybody, a family member who is a European citizen themselves, would apply in their own right. But the family members of an EU or EEA citizen who is not themselves an EEA or EU citizen can apply through this scheme as well. It applies to those who are living in the UK by the 31st of December 2020. It doesn't apply to Irish nationals Irish nationals come under a separate arrangement with the UK called the Common Travel Area, which means that Irish nationals enjoy freedom of movement between the UK and Ireland, regardless of our position in the EU. But anybody who is Irish and has a non-EU family member will need to apply through this scheme. And that means that there are advantages in some cases for Irish nationals to apply. It's not compulsory, but it can sometimes facilitate the application process for their non-EU family member. So we'll come on to talk about how non-EU family members apply in a later slide. So we left the EU on the 31st of January and the transition period began. On the basis that we will hopefully leave with a deal, the deadline for EU citizens arriving for the first time in the UK and who won't be subject to the new immigration rules, which will come in from 2021, those individuals arriving will need to be in the UK by the 31st of December this year. And then they must go on to apply for EU settlement scheme by no later than the 30th of June 2021. That's laid down within the withdrawal agreement. The government are fairly adamant at the moment that they're not going to extend that transition period beyond the 31st of December, despite the situation with COVID. Yeah, there are schools of thought that suggest that simply won't be possible, that it will have to be extended. But at the moment, we don't know any certainty around that. So really, we're working towards the 31st of December deadline for those individuals needing to be residing in the UK in order to apply through the EU settlement scheme. So when individuals apply to the settlement scheme, there are one of two outcomes. The first is a settled status, which is also called indefinite leave to remain. And indefinite leave to remain is actually the terminology used on a lot of the documentation that the applicant will get from the Home Office as an outcome to their application to the scheme. Settled status is applicable to those individuals who've been residing in the UK for 5 years or more. That's 5 years of continuous residence. Continuous residence means at least 6 months in any 12-month qualifying period. There are some exceptions to this for individuals in particularly difficult circumstances. Perhaps that individual has been ill, seriously ill, and has wanted to go home to seek medical treatment from their home state. There's also a concession for those individuals who have been pregnant or have had children. They are able to leave the UK for up to 12 months. And there are extended absence periods of up to 12 months for those who have studied abroad or who have been posted abroad as part of their job or their employment. So when making an application and wanting to seek settled status, which is based on the 5 years continuous residency, if there have been any absences of over 6 months, they must come under some of the exemption qualification criteria, and the individual will be required to submit some evidence in respect of that. So, for example, a letter from the university confirming that a period of overseas study has taken place, or overseas posting as part of their role. The settled status, if granted, will provide that individual with protection in terms of their rights to work, study, access the NHS and most social security and benefits based on the fact that they've got that settled status and they are habitually resident in the UK. Once settled status has been granted, the individual can then leave the UK for up to 5 years without losing that settled status. So if circumstances change and the individual needs to go or has a new job, goes back, just leaves the UK for any period of time, the status is protected, meaning that they can come back to the UK and carry on as normal, still with the settled status, still with the indefinite leave to remain, providing that that period of absence hasn't been any more than 5 years. That's 5 years in any one sitting, so not accumulative. So for instance, an individual who was out of the UK for a year, came back for another 2 years, then went away again for another year, that doesn't count towards the 5 years. It would be a 5-year continuous period that would mean the individual was at risk of losing their settled status. And then those individuals who've not been in the UK full 5 years or haven't been able to meet the continuous residency requirements will be awarded pre-settled status, which is also called limited leave to remain. Again, this gives that individual access to working rights, study, NHS and some social security benefits, although some restrictions will apply to that, because some benefits are based on residency and contribution through the NI system. There's different criteria that people have to meet in order to access those benefits. The individual with pre-settled status is able to leave the UK for up to 2 years without losing the pre-settled status. However, this is a little bit of a bit of a trick really on the part of the Home Office. Leaving the UK for up to 2 years would break the continuity of residence for that individual if that individual had any intention of getting settled status in the future. Because if we consider that to get settled status, you need to be absent for no more than 6 months in most cases, in any 12-month qualifying period. By being away for 2 years, it's going to be impossible for that individual to ever reach the point where they're able to make a settled status application. And what limited leave to remain means is it is limited to a duration of 5 years. From the date that the status is awarded. And so the individual would need to make an application to upgrade to settled status at some point within that 5-year validity. So we generally advise people who get pre-settled status to make the upgrade application as soon as they can, as soon as they reach their 5th year anniversary of residing in the UK, submit that application as soon as they can, get the settled status. It's a better and more secure status and allows for more flexibility in terms of absences in the future. But if that individual has not been in the UK for more than 6 months in any 12-month qualifying period, it's going to break that qualifying period. So it's really important to maybe think about whether that individual wants to leave the UK for extended periods of time, when considered that it might not then be possible to gain the settled status in the future. So the process, for the majority of people, the process will be straightforward. It's a digital process, which means that individuals, do have to have a level of digital and IT knowledge in order to make the application. But it's something that friends and family can help with, and it's something that student support can help with, or HR departments, and obviously something that organisations like Newfields and myself can help with, because there's lots of support services out there deliberately set up to assist people in making their application. So the process involves evidencing identity. That is through typically passports or national identity cards that contain a biometric chip. So individuals who don't have a biometric chip in their passport or their national ID document do have the option of either sending their document in the post, although that route is currently closed because of the COVID-19 restrictions, but that is the way around making an application if you don't have a biometric document. A biometric document is hopefully will apply to most people, and in which case those individuals will be able to evidence their identity via downloading a special app. It's called the EUSS ID Check app, either on an Android or on an iOS Apple platform. That will allow the individual to scan their own identity document, meaning they won't have to send it away. Alternatively, there are various ID scanning sites across the UK. They were quite sparsely spread at one point, but they are opening up more and more. That said, they are currently closed because of the COVID-19 situation. But they will reopen eventually. There's one in Cardiff. You can book an appointment to go to the Cardiff Scanning Centre, and it's at the registry office in the Civic Centre, so nice and close to the university. And people can get their ID documents scanned there. I'm just noting there is a question in the chat box about national insurance numbers. The evidence of residency is conducted via filling in an online application form after having evidenced identity by either the ID scanning app or by the attending a centre or sending by post. The most easiest and straightforward way of doing that should be via national insurance numbers. You enter national insurance number into the application form, and there is an automatic behind the scenes check once the application is submitted to identify people who have been through the national insurance system, so either working or anybody who might have claimed any benefits or access services would be able to potentially evidence their identity, their residency, via the national insurance number. But if people haven't got a national insurance number, fret not, it's not a mandatory piece of information. It will simply mean that that individual will have to upload additional documents evidencing their residency for the relevant period of time in the UK. So anybody who doesn't have a national insurance number just needs to enter on the form that they don't have one. People who do have a national insurance number should enter it, because it will potentially avoid them having to upload any additional documentation. But our experience shows that some national insurance numbers for individuals are quite patchy, not through any fault of their own, but just because the national insurance records are not always the best in terms of record keeping, and there might be gaps in the national insurance record, either because the individual has had gaps in employment, or because they might have been self-employed, in which case the national insurance records are all a little bit different. But again, if there's not a complete record through the national insurance system, the applicant will be invited to upload additional documents showing evidence of residency. Evidence of residency can be via council tax letters, letters from university, letters from employers, letters from GP, P60s, anything official that shows your name and address as a UK address. You can use utility bills, phone bills. The Home Office are reasonably flexible on what they will accept. It is better if you can possibly use documents that cover longer periods of time, so ideally up to 12 months, so things like council tax letters or letters from the university or employer if you've been employed for a long period of time, like maybe upwards of sort of like 1, 2, 3 years. Or for the entire period. That would, if you were employed for the last 5 years by the university and you submitted a letter from the university saying that, then that would count one document towards your entire 5-year residency. There's no need to show anything more than 5 years. 5 years is the criteria for a settled status. So once you've hit 5 years, that would be what the status you would get. I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat box. So there's a question about children, which I think I'll come on to in just a second. And then another one about scanning the passport some months ago. Okay. I'll just talk the rest about the process, and then I'll come back to those 2 questions. But proving your status at the end of the application process. So once the application has been submitted, all the information is assessed by the Home Office, and all being well, the status outcome will be with that individual, they say within no more than a month, but our experience at the moment is that applications can take significantly longer, particularly at the moment with the COVID shutdown. There is no cost to applying, it's a free of charge application. The only slight exception to that is non-EU family members who may have to attend an appointment to provide their biometrics. And those appointments, whilst you can find free of charge appointments, there are some expedited appointments that do carry a charge. It's usually around about the 100 to £180 mark. Again, it's not compulsory to pay those appointment fees. If you can find a free appointment and don't mind waiting a little bit, then go for a free appointment. So there's a question in the chat box about being asked for additional documentation up to 7 years. It does do that. It does ask for some years above and beyond 5 years, but providing you could submit evidence, say from 2020 back to 2015, then that individual has met the 5-year criteria. The application would have to be granted for settled status upon evidencing the 5 years, not the 7 years. I think the additional years that they ask for is probably to give a little bit of a sort of an overlap with points of the year. So if you're applying early in 2020, then it would have to go back possibly to 2014 rather than 2015. 2013 does seem early. I have seen it before, but I have also submitted applications that have asked for, say, 2013 and sometimes even 2012, I think, in the early days. But as long as we submitted evidence from the date of the application backwards 5 years, that those clients were granted their settled status. So if you can't provide the 6th and 7th year, just submit the 5 years and you should get your settled status based on that. So we've got some really good self-help materials for those who want to give this a try themselves. For the majority of people, it is straightforward. There's a really useful walkthrough video courtesy of an organisation called Free Movement, which is a really, really good organisation, real good champion for immigration rights, and particularly at the moment championing the rights of EU citizens. The EUSS guidance document is also available via an organisation called We Are Digital. That is a handbook that has literally a step-by-step guide to each and every screen, including the ID document scanning app that people can follow to take them through the application process from beginning to end. And then we also have a lot of information on an FAQ site on our website at newfieldslaw.com/EUSS. These slides will be circulated at the end of this session, so if you don't get the opportunity to note down those websites, it will be circulated in due course. Just to go back to the app, somebody has asked on the chat, they thought that the app was not available on Apple phones. That was the case, but since I think it was about November last year, I forget exactly when, but the app has become available on Apple phones. So you can now download it onto the OIS. I think you have to have an OIS 7 or 8 system. I don't have an Apple phone, so I'm not quite sure the terminology, but it is available. Alternatively, if you've got a family member who has an Android phone, they can also download the app. The information that is scanned via the app is not stored on the phone itself. It's extracted onto a platform hosted by the Home Office, and it's transferred directly to that individual's application. It's not stored on the phone. There's a privacy statement at the end of the app process that tells people a bit more about that. But if you have a friend who has a device that can do the scanning of the app, downloading of the app and the scanning of the document, don't necessarily let that put you off using somebody else's phone. I'm just looking at another question. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the blue. Somebody's asked about a blue document that was raised upon successful application for the settled status before the online app system came to life. I think that might be something that it might be worth dropping me an email about directly, and I will try and ascertain what status that person had when they applied for quite an early application. I think possibly through the pilot scheme. Anyway, I'll carry on. Anybody who had a permanent residence document, so permanent residence documents are documents issued under EEA regulations, and some people applied for these, in which case they will have a permanent residence document, generally printed on a piece of paper or inside a passport. That was evidence enough through the EU settlement scheme to get settled status, providing that that individual hasn't then been absent from the UK for any more than 5 years in the intervening period. A permanent residence document under EEA regulations is going to be phased out in terms of being a document to evidence right of residency after the end of the transition period. So those with permanent residency documents do still need to apply to the EU settlement scheme, but it will be a more streamlined process for those individuals who will simply have to enter the details of their permanent residence card as part of the application process, and then confirm that they haven't been absent from the UK for 5 years. The application will still be subject to criminality and security checks, but the permanent residence document itself will be enough to verify identity and residency in one shot. So it will mean a more streamlined process, but those individuals do still have to apply. This probably won't affect loads of people, but we've seen it with individuals who maybe been here for many decades before freedom of movement became an option between that European country and the UK. Strictly speaking, those with indefinite leave to remain or enter the UK don't have to apply to the settlement scheme, but we do advise it because for a number of reasons. One, it will hopefully avoid any time-consuming immigration checks that will probably end up being introduced following the UK's departure from the EU. It also brings that individual's status up to date. The indefinite leave to remain and enter statuses are really quite old now, and only really apply to people who came to the UK probably sort of like pre-80s. And by having the settled status, it brings that status up to date. It also brings with it enhanced family reunion rights, so those wishing to bring non-EU family members to the UK after the EU settlement scheme ends will be able to do so if they have a status through the EU settlement scheme, but wouldn't if they remained on the old style indefinite leave. And also there is an advantage to having settled status in that the old style indefinite leave allows for an absence of up to 2 years only, whereas settled status allows up to 5 years. So there's a question on the chat about non-EU family members who are with settled status. Can they then travel to the EU without a visa? That settled status is relevant to the UK only. If there are requirements on that non-EU family member to have a visa to travel to a European country, a third country, then that individual will have to go through that visa application process. The settlement scheme is completely detached from anything to do with Europe. It's just a UK thing. It allows EU citizens and their family members to reside, to study, to work in the UK, but it is restricted to that. Children. So I remember there was a question regarding children in the chat box, so I'll just scroll back to that quickly. Children are considered to be individuals who are under 21. Children can be children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. Children are not able to gain an automatic status simply through the fact that their parent has applied for a status through the EU settlement scheme. They have to submit an application in their own right. So if the child is older, teenage years, perhaps that child can make an independent application themselves. If they're very young, then obviously the parent would need to make an application on their behalf. But it is really important that people understand that children don't just assume the status of the parent. They do have to physically submit an application either for themselves or have it submitted on their behalf. Saying that, the applicant who's under 21 can apply for, when submitting their application, can either use their own eligibility in terms of residence. So if the child has been here for 5 years, they can get their settled status. But if the child either isn't old enough to have had settled status in their own right through being resident for 5 years, or it's more difficult sometimes to prove that, but the parent, one parent has settled status, then the child can apply using that parent's eligibility to settled status, and therefore they can gain settled status regardless of the fact that they may not have been in the UK for 5 continuous years residency. When applying on the basis of the parent's eligibility, the child applicant will have to upload their birth certificate to evidence the relationship between them and that parent they're claiming has settled status. It's worth the parent making their application first. It will generate a reference number, an application reference number, and then as part of the child application, the child application will ask for the reference number that the adults, the parents, obtained for their application, and it will link the two in terms of residency. So the child would still have to have an ID document, a passport or a ID card. If there's no electronic component to that ID card, so there's no biometric chip, I think potentially is what the question, one of the questions on the chat is, then the option would be to post that document. It couldn't be scanned because it's got no chip, but there is the option to post the document. I know posting the document sounds a bit scary. Prior to COVID-19, and since then they've shut it down anyway, but prior to COVID-19 they were really quite quick in returning documents. They didn't hold on to those documents for very long. They received the document, did what they needed to do with it, and sent it straight back to the applicant. They didn't wait for the application to be processed before returning the passport or the ID document. It was sent out straight away. It's a sort of separate process, if you like. I did see a question here about residing in student accommodation and whether that would be sufficient evidence to show residency. Yes, if there's a letter or a tenancy agreement, then that is evidence, that should be evidence enough to say that that individual has been residing for that claimed period of time. Non-EU EEA family members are divided into two categories: those that are close family members and those that are extended family members. For close family members, those that are eligible are spouses and civil partners, children under the age of 21, dependent parents or grandparents, and durable partners. So durable partner is somebody who is not married but living in a relationship akin to a marriage. Generally, the Home Office look for people to have been living together in a relationship akin to a marriage for at least 2 years, unless there is another significant evidence of that relationship subsisting. For instance, if the couple have a child and have joint responsibility for that child, that can act as a sort of an exception to the need to evidence 2 years worth of residence, evidence of living in a relationship akin to a marriage. The extended family members, there is a requirement on extended family members to be somehow dependent on their EU sponsor. So the EU sponsor is the EU family member. If those extended family members rely on those EU sponsors financially for welfare, for support, perhaps those individuals need care, extensive care in order to, from that EU sponsor, then those individuals would be able to apply through the EU settlement scheme. There would be an additional requirement to evidence that level of dependency. It applies to those living in the UK by the 31st of December who can apply under the EU settlement scheme, but non-EEA family members can still join their EU family member in the UK, providing the relationship was in existence before the end of the transition period on the 31st of December 2020, and they would be able to apply through the EU family permit route in order to join that EU family member in the UK anytime before the 29th of March 2022. Again, a bit like the situation with children, it's advantageous for the EU national to apply for the EU settlement scheme first, obtain their reference number, and then provide that to the family member in order to make their application, and it helps to link up the two applications. It also means that the family member doesn't have to prove the identity of their the nationality identity of their EU sponsor, because the EU sponsor has already scanned their ID document through their own application. They would still have to provide evidence of the relationship and their own residency in the UK, but it would make it slightly easier to do that if their EU sponsor has already made an application. Somebody on the chat is still querying the passport return. I think initially the passports, if you sent them in the post, did take a little while to come back, but my personal experience is that they have been particularly quick in the run-up to when they ceased taking the postal applications before COVID-19 shut down. Obviously, you know, there might be the odd case that takes longer. I can understand people being reticent about supplying their passport via the post, but unfortunately, if it's not got a chip, that's generally the only way in which to evidence identity. So just hope for the best. Keep records of everything that's sent, so send documents by recorded delivery, track them using the tracking number, and you know, if worst happens, and we hope it doesn't, and I haven't heard of anything happening, please do get in touch with somebody like ourselves, and we can try our best to help track that down. The application process for non-EEA family members is pretty much the same as those who are EU nationals. Scanning the documents via the either the app, attending a document scanning centre, or sending in the post. The individual who doesn't have a biometric card already, non-EEA nationals residing in the UK, have to have a biometric card, generally speaking, for any new applications. So if that family member hasn't already got one, they will be invited to get a biometric card, which will mean attending an appointment at a visa application centre. There are 2 in Cardiff, so we are quite lucky in the sense that we have centres that are local to us. But if the individual already has a biometric card, they will just continue with that until it expires and then be invited to update it. The family members will be asked to identify their own residency, their own identity, and that of their sponsor and their sponsor's residency. Again, if their sponsor has already applied for the EU settlement scheme or is in the is waiting an outcome on that application, they will have evidenced their identity and their residency as the EU sponsor. So by supplying the reference number for the EU sponsor to the family member, they can link up the applications. Those with a permanent resident card will be able to meet all of those 5 criteria just through evidencing the permanent residence card in the same similar way to an EU national would be able to verify their residency just via a permanent residence card. The non-EEA family member will be able to do the same, as well as evidencing the sponsor's identity and the relationship. Other citizens who are eligible to apply include those non-EU spouses who have since divorced their EU partners, can, if they meet certain criteria, apply through the EU settlement scheme, as can spouses where the EU partner has died, and there are specific routes for non-EU carers of British or EU children and adults. So those some of the more complex applications, more likely for those individuals who maybe fall into those categories to need some support and assistance. We've done a number of those application types now, so really would invite anybody who knows of anybody who might fall into those categories or who is struggling with their application to please get in touch. So we've noticed that some of the barriers to making applications generally revolve around IT and technology problems, either a lack of ID documents or, again, as we've touched upon already, individuals not having the biometric documents, which mean having to post the documents away to the Home Office. Some people struggle to meet the residency requirements through documentation. So if the national insurance number doesn't prove to be enough, the other option is to upload documents, but we do find people come into problems with this, particularly if maybe they haven't formed their own personal tenancy agreement with a landlord, or they haven't featured on any bills. It's quite common where maybe a couple live together and everything to do with the household affairs comes in just the one name, and the other partner doesn't have anything included on their name. Council tax, utility bills, that kind of thing. From the perspective of the university, if the individual is a student and can verify their residency via letters from the university, then that's really good. We find GP registration as well to be quite a useful one for people who don't necessarily appear on utility bills or council tax or tenancy agreements. If the doctor can provide you, or the NHS can provide you with a letter saying you're registered with a GP and have attended regularly. In theory, the Home Office generally like it to be a bit more specific than that, but to use an example of an individual who we helped, who was on the streets, who was homeless, a really easy way for him to have got settled status turned out to be simply through providing letters that confirmed that individual's engagement with support services and GPs. It didn't have to be a utility bill or one of the more sort of traditional evidence of residency documents, because in that case the individual simply didn't have those. Again, if you're struggling for residency documents, please get in touch with either student support at the university, your HR department, or indeed us. We'd be able to assist you with any gaps in residency documents and make some suggestions as to what alternatives could be used. A lot of people just don't simply know that the EU settlement scheme exists, or that they need to apply, or that it applies to them. We've sort of touched upon some of the issues with children. Some individuals just don't think that their children need to apply because the parents have applied, and the assumption is that the children assume the same status as the parent. As we've said, that's not the case. We also find that individuals who are married to British citizens, often there's a misconception that they don't have to apply, but again, they do have to apply. Marriage or civil partnerships with British nationals does not exempt them from needing to make an application through the EU settlement scheme. We've touched on incomplete national insurance records. It's really quite common, so if it happens to you as an applicant, don't panic. It's not anything to do with you, or it's not your fault. The national insurance records and the tax records held by the UK government are notoriously bad and often have quite big gaps in them. So it is literally a case of uploading additional residency documents. Don't be put off by doing that. it's not going to be detrimental to your application. It's just another means of which to evidence residency. And as we've discussed, some people simply don't have a national insurance number, so it doesn't preclude them from getting a status. It's just an alternative method of doing it. If somebody applies for settled status on the basis that they've lived in the UK for 5 years or more, and they are offered pre-settled status because for whatever reason the automatic checks or the they haven't been able to verify that individual's residency for 5 years, then please do not accept pre-settled status if the individual is entitled to settled status. Settled status is one you want to get because it's permanent. You don't have to upgrade it in the future. You don't have to remember to upgrade it in the future. Somebody who gets pre-settled status and then has to remember in 2, 3, 4 years time to upgrade it, there is a risk that those individuals will forget to do that. So if you can get settled status from the outset, please do get that. And again, if it means that you're having to provide additional evidence and you're struggling with that, please do seek support, because there is lots of support out there to assist you with those things. If you apply and you still get the wrong status, then as long as the scheme remains open, which it will do until end of June 2021, you can simply reapply free of charge. Submit new application, submit new evidence, and you'll get, hopefully the second time round, get the settled status that they're entitled to. If the person does not have additional documentation, or they think that their application has not been assessed against the criteria correctly, they can ask for something called an administrative review. But at the moment, that's not always a very attractive option because it does cost the applicant £80 to submit that administrative review. And if the person submits the administrative review on the basis of new documentation that wasn't submitted in the original application, then you will not get that £80 refunded if it's successful. If it's successful on the basis of the information that was originally submitted in the original application, then the £80 would be refunded, because it was the Home Office's error. They didn't assess the application properly. They would refund the money. But if new evidence was submitted, then they would keep that £80 even if it was granted successfully. So the position of EU citizens coming to the UK after the end of the transition period, so from 1st of January 2021, there'll be a new skills-based immigration system that's going to be implemented in phases from January 2021. There's quite a bit of general information available about this already on the Home Office's website. It will be based on the skill level associated with job roles, minimum pay thresholds. There will be additional points awarded, so it's a points-based system for individuals who are coming to do roles in science, STEM, STEM subjects. But it will be a more complicated process than going through the EU settlement scheme. So anybody who wants to get a status and is already here, please do apply through the EU settlement scheme by the relevant deadlines. And anybody who might be thinking of coming to the UK will have a much easier time in terms of regularising their status if they were to come before the end of 2020 and apply under the EU settlement scheme. Coming after the end of the transition period from the 1st of January next year will mean coming through the new system, which there'll be more criteria which that individual then has to meet. So I've just included this slide for people to take away, really, because our experience of delivering these sessions has been that there are a number of people who are interested in becoming British. It's not a requirement. Indefinite leave to remain or settled status does give a secure status, allows pretty much all of the same eligibility in terms of access to benefits, work, study, unlimited leave to stay in the UK, to live in the UK. But some people do find they want to maybe investigate whether they want to become British in the future, or it might be more relevant for children. I'm not going to go into detail about it today because citizenship law is very complicated and is particularly tailored to an individual's personal circumstances, but in most cases those with settled status will become eligible to apply for British citizenship if they want to 12 months after being granted settled status. It's important to remember that children born in the UK are not automatically British. They might be, but they may not be as well. There are a number of criteria that have to be met, including absence restrictions. So there's a total number of absences that the person can have in the qualifying period leading up to applying for British citizenship, as well as an additional requirement to have with no more than 90 days absence in the preceding 12 months leading up to the application. EU citizens wishing to consider British citizenship should first consult their own embassy to check whether they're able to hold more than one nationality, and by applying for British citizenship doesn't mean that they then have to relinquish their European nationality, because that does sometimes apply. It's not a cheap process to apply for British citizenship, which again might be another reason why people don't do it. It is approximately £1,600 to obtain British citizenship, which includes the fees for things like English language tests, if applicable, life in the UK tests, and attending ceremonies. It might be possible to register as a British citizen if specific criteria are met. And that little diagram there is courtesy again of that organisation called Free Movement, and I thought it was very useful because it does give a clear representation of which scenarios fall into the automatic or the application and registration criteria for routes to British citizenship. But that website there as well gives an overview of how to reach British citizenship depending on individual circumstances. So final slides, and we're coming to the end. Thank you everyone for your patience and for listening. I will just have a quick review of the questions just to check I haven't missed anything from the chat box. But before I do that, anybody wishing to have further assistance, that's our website with some FAQs on it. It also links to some of those self-help guides. We do these sessions from time to time through the university, so please check the staff blast or the student intranet for any future publicising of events. We do offer support for anybody wishing to submit applications to the EU settlement scheme, but we do particularly specialise in some of those more complex areas that are listed there. But I understand as well that there is an organisation called Settled, and there are some volunteers that work for that organisation, and I think they might have connections with Unison as well, who are on campus and on site as well to assist with some levels, some more straightforward applications. So probably the first port of call if you want to find out who to approach maybe, and who's best to approach to get in touch with international student support at iss@cardiff.ac.uk, or the HR, or your relevant HR contact in your department, and they can put you in touch with either one of those volunteers, or you're more than welcome, again, as I've said, to contact us for we have a settled volunteer attending this session, so they exist. I'm glad I mentioned it, and yeah, everyone's here to help in whatever way that we possibly can with any application support. That's it from me. So those are our contact details. I hope the presentation was okay. This is probably my first one running this solo, so keeping an eye on the questions and operating the slideshow as well. So I hope I've done it justice. And again, if I have missed anything, please do get in touch with me there. My contact details are there. I'm just having a quick scan back through the application, the chat box, sorry. So there was a question about the blue documents that were issued. I think whatever document maybe anybody had from the past, unless it was an indefinite leave to remain document, it means that you will still have to apply through the EU settlement scheme to get a status through the settlement scheme. A permanent residency card was a permanent resident card underneath EEA rules and regulations, but now that the UK is leaving the EU, unfortunately the permanent residency card isn't really permanent anymore, and it does need to be upgraded through the settlement scheme. Somebody who had problems scanning lost the email link. Somebody called Weenand. I think maybe if you could drop me a line, maybe we can have a chat about that specifically, and I can help you through anything there. But if there's no more questions, thank you very much for attending, and good luck with your applications if you haven't made one already. And yeah, please do tell friends, family, anybody who might be impacted by this, who's from the EU or who have EU family members and friends. Please do let them know what services are available to help them. This is a Wales-wide service. It's not limited to Cardiff, so please do let people know that we exist, because we're here to help. All right, thank you very much, everybody.